When Adolf Hitler launched his massive invasion of the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941, the entire balance of the Second World War shifted overnight. For Joseph Stalin, the attack was both a catastrophe and a vindication of his deepest fears. Despite the non-aggression pact signed only 2 years earlier, Stalin had always suspected that Germany would one day strike east. Now the blow had fallen with devastating force, and the Red Army reeled under the assault. Entire divisions were encircled, cities fell, and within months, German forces stood at the gates of Moscow. At that moment, Stalin faced a stark truth. Without help from abroad, the Soviet Union might not survive. In Washington, Franklin Delano Roosevelt watched the unfolding events with grim determination. For months, he had been steering the United States toward greater involvement in the conflict, supplying Britain with weapons and resources under the program known as Lend-Lease. He had long believed that Nazi Germany was a threat not only to Europe, but to the stability of the world. Now, with Hitler's armies striking deep into Soviet territory, Roosevelt saw an opportunity as well as a danger. The Soviet Union, once regarded with suspicion, was now a potential ally in the struggle against fascism. If it collapsed, Germany would dominate the continent. If it survived, it could bleed the Wehrmacht and hasten Hitler's defeat. Thus began one of the most improbable partnerships of the 20th century. Stalin, the dictator of a one-party state who had built his power through purges and terror, and Roosevelt, the president of a democracy who spoke of freedom and human rights, found themselves forced into cooperation by the logic of survival. They did not trust one another. They did not share common values. Yet necessity bound them together, and from that necessity grew the strange relationship that would shape the end of the war and the beginning of a new era. The first contacts were pragmatic. Soviet diplomats approached Washington with requests for weapons, trucks, food, and raw materials. Roosevelt responded quickly, bypassing skeptics in Congress and within his own administration who recoiled at the idea of supporting communism. He argued that defeating Hitler outweighed ideological differences. His famous phrase that, "the enemy of my enemy is my friend," captured the essence of his reasoning. The Lend-Lease program was extended to the Soviet Union, and soon convoys of ships braved the Arctic seas to deliver supplies to Murmansk and Archangel. American factories produced jeeps, planes, and canned goods that kept Soviet soldiers alive on the front lines. Stalin acknowledged this help with calculated gratitude. He wrote letters to Roosevelt, sometimes curt, sometimes warm, always emphasizing the urgency of Soviet needs. He demanded more tanks, more aircraft, more guns. For Stalin, the alliance was not about friendship, but about survival. Yet even in his stern communications, there was a recognition that Roosevelt was different from Churchill, the British Prime Minister. Stalin distrusted Churchill's imperial instincts and suspected him of harboring ambitions against Soviet interests. Roosevelt, in contrast, appeared less bound by old European rivalries. To Stalin, this made him a more promising partner. The correspondence between the two leaders became a lifeline of the alliance. Roosevelt, ever the optimist, often wrote in personal tones, addressing Stalin as a comrade in arms. He hoped that personal diplomacy could soften the iron edges of Stalin's suspicion. Stalin replied in his own way, sometimes blunt, sometimes unexpectedly cordial. Gradually, through these letters and through the shipments of supplies, a sense of working partnership began to emerge. It was fragile, built on necessity, but it carried the possibility of something more. By late 1941 and early 1942, as Soviet forces held the line at Moscow and then launched their counteroffensive, Roosevelt's gamble seemed justified. The Soviet Union had not collapsed. It was fighting back with ferocity, and every German soldier tied down in the east was one less facing the British or threatening the Atlantic. Roosevelt's decision to support Stalin became easier to defend at home. Newspapers that once denounced communism now published stories of heroic Soviet resistance. American audiences saw images of women and men in uniform defending their homeland with courage, and for a brief moment the chasm between systems seemed less important than the common struggle. Still, the partnership was never free of tension. Stalin pressed constantly for the opening of a second front in Western Europe, demanding that British and American forces invade France to relieve pressure on the east. Roosevelt sympathized but knew it was not yet possible. American forces were still mobilizing, and Churchill argued for a Mediterranean strategy instead. Stalin interpreted the delays as betrayal, suspecting that the West wanted the Soviet Union to bleed itself white before real help would come. Roosevelt walked a delicate line, reassuring Stalin of his commitment while balancing the realities of military planning. Despite these suspicions, moments of warmth did occur. When Roosevelt sent his trusted envoy Harry Hopkins to Moscow, Stalin opened up more than usual. Hopkins reported back that beneath Stalin's harsh exterior, there was a shrewd but pragmatic leader who could be reasoned with. Roosevelt took this to heart, believing that personal engagement could maintain cooperation. He imagined a post-war world where the United States and the Soviet Union would work together within a framework of collective security, preventing the mistakes that had followed the First World War. The alliance was therefore both real and illusory. It was real in the sense that without it, the war could not have been won. The Soviet Union absorbed the bulk of German aggression, and American industry provided essential support. It was illusory in that the underlying mistrust never disappeared. Each side saw the other not as a friend, but as a temporary partner against a common foe. The seeds of future conflict were already present, hidden beneath the surface of cooperation. As the first conferences approached, the outlines of this complex relationship became clearer. Stalin and Roosevelt would meet in person at Tehran and later at Yalta, moments when their partnership reached its peak. But already in the early years of the war, the pattern was set. They needed one another. They tolerated one another. And at times, they even seemed to like one another. Yet they never forgot that their systems were fundamentally opposed. The story of Stalin and Roosevelt's alliance begins, then, not with genuine friendship, but with the crucible of war. It was forged in desperation, sustained by mutual benefit, and illuminated by Roosevelt's hope that cooperation could endure. For a brief time, it seemed possible that two men so different could stand together not only as wartime allies, but as architects of a lasting peace. The tragedy of the later years was that this fragile bond, born of necessity, would unravel under the weight of mistrust, ambition, and ideology. By the middle years of the Second World War, the relationship between Joseph Stalin and Franklin Roosevelt had moved from wary correspondence to face-to-face diplomacy. The stakes of their alliance could not have been higher. Hitler's armies still raged across Eastern Europe. The British Empire struggled to maintain its position, and the American military was only beginning to gather its full power. At such a moment, the fragile thread binding Moscow and Washington carried immense weight. It was more than a partnership of convenience. It was the foundation of victory itself. Roosevelt approached the relationship with characteristic optimism. Though fully aware of Stalin's brutality, he believed that trust could be cultivated through personal engagement. He imagined that if the leaders of the great powers sat together, looked one another in the eye, and shared meals as well as strategies, suspicion might yield to cooperation. Stalin, hardened by decades of intrigue and bloodshed, viewed Roosevelt with cautious interest. He recognized in the American president not only a source of crucial supplies, but also a figure willing to treat him as an equal, rather than as an untrustworthy revolutionary. For a man obsessed with respect and recognition, this mattered. The first great encounter came at the Tehran Conference in late 1943. It was a moment long awaited, for Stalin had insisted repeatedly that his allies must open a second front in Europe. Until then, the Soviet Union bore the brunt of the fighting, enduring unimaginable losses. Now the leaders of the so-called Big Three, Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill, gathered in the Iranian capital to chart the course of the war. The atmosphere was charged with both camaraderie and tension. Roosevelt, despite fragile health, made the arduous journey determined to demonstrate commitment. Stalin arrived confident, buoyed by the Red Army's victories at Stalingrad and Kursk, which had turned the tide on the Eastern Front. Churchill, though a towering figure of rhetoric, found himself often outmaneuvered by his two partners. Roosevelt sometimes sided with Stalin to balance against Churchill's imperial instincts, believing that Britain's colonial ambitions were obstacles to the post-war order he envisioned. Stalin appreciated this dynamic and used it shrewdly, cultivating an image of Roosevelt as the more flexible partner. At Tehran, The decision was made to launch Operation Overlord, the invasion of France, in the summer of 1944. This was the long-promised Second Front, and for Stalin, it was a crucial commitment. He pressed relentlessly for assurances, and Roosevelt, aware of the trust at stake, gave them. In those days, Stalin regarded Roosevelt as the one Western leader who genuinely grasped the scale of Soviet sacrifice. Roosevelt, in turn, saw Stalin as a man who could be bargained with, a leader whose sense of realpolitik could align with American aims if treated with respect. Conversations extended beyond military plans. The three men discussed the architecture of a future peace. Roosevelt floated his vision of a United Nations, an institution that would prevent another global catastrophe by binding nations together under collective security. Stalin listened carefully, calculating how such a structure might serve Soviet interests. He gave cautious approval, understanding that to be part of such a system was to acknowledge the Soviet Union as a legitimate global power. For Roosevelt, this was precisely the point. Only by including Moscow within an international framework could peace endure. The personal chemistry, though never warm in a conventional sense, produced results. Stalin, who rarely trusted outsiders, expressed satisfaction with Roosevelt's manner. The American president avoided the lecturing tone that so often soured Churchill's dealings with the Soviet leader. Instead, Roosevelt framed discussions in practical terms, focused on immediate goals and long-term stability. This approach earned grudging respect from Stalin, who valued outcomes above rhetoric. The partnership reached its symbolic height at the Yalta Conference in February of 1945. The war in Europe was nearing its end. Soviet armies were already deep in Poland, pushing inexorably toward Berlin. American and British forces had crossed into Western Europe after D-Day and were advancing toward the Rhine. Victory was now a matter of time, and the question that haunted Yalta was what the peace would look like once the guns fell silent. Roosevelt arrived weakened by illness, but his determination remained strong. He saw Yalta as his opportunity to secure the future, to transform wartime alliance into lasting cooperation. Stalin arrived from a position of strength, his troops occupying much of Eastern Europe. Churchill, ever wary of Soviet intentions, pushed for safeguards to ensure that smaller nations would not be swallowed by Moscow's influence. Between these poles, Roosevelt sought to mediate, to hold together a vision of unity that could outlast the war. The agreements at Yalta reflected both hope and ambiguity. The leaders confirmed the creation of the United Nations, with the Soviet Union granted a permanent seat on the Security Council. They pledged that liberated nations would hold free elections, a promise that Stalin endorsed publicly even as he prepared privately to shape outcomes to his liking. They divided Germany into zones of occupation, assigning responsibility to each ally, and laid plans for reparations. They also secured Soviet entry into the war against Japan, a commitment Roosevelt valued as a way to shorten the Pacific conflict and save American lives. For a brief moment, Yalta seemed to embody the spirit of partnership. Roosevelt wrote afterwards of his belief that cooperation with Stalin could form the cornerstone of post-war peace. He believed that mutual respect, built during years of struggle, could restrain future rivalries. To Roosevelt, Stalin was difficult, suspicious, and ruthless, but also pragmatic, a man who could keep his word if his interests were met. The president hoped that by anchoring the Soviet Union within an international order, mistrust could be contained. Stalin, for his part, left Yalta satisfied. He had secured recognition of Soviet influence in Eastern Europe, promises of reparations, and assurances that his nation's immense sacrifices would be acknowledged. He admired Roosevelt's pragmatism and noted his willingness to distance himself from Churchill when necessary. Yet even in satisfaction lay suspicion. Stalin never abandoned the belief that the West might one day turn against him, that promises could be masks for hidden plots. At Tehran and Yalta, therefore, the alliance between Stalin and Roosevelt reached its zenith. They were not friends in any conventional sense, but they were partners who had together shaped the course of the war and the outlines of peace. Roosevelt believed he had found a way to bridge the gulf between democracy and dictatorship, between capitalism and communism. Stalin believed he had maneuvered his nation into a position of unprecedented strength. For both men, cooperation was real, tangible, and productive. Yet beneath the surface, the differences that would soon turn allies into adversaries were already visible. The promises of free elections would become points of bitter contention. The division of Germany would evolve into confrontation. The optimism of Roosevelt's vision would clash with the harsh realities of Soviet control. What seemed at Yalta to be the triumph of unity was also the seedbed of division. For the moment, however, the world saw only the image of the Big Three standing together, smiling for cameras, symbols of a grand alliance that had brought humanity to the threshold of victory. The tragedy was that the friendship forged in those halls would not survive the transition from war to peace. By the spring of 1944 and into the early months of 1945, the alliance between Joseph Stalin and Franklin Roosevelt stood at its strongest on the surface and at its weakest beneath. Together, they had pledged victory, and together they had mapped the outlines of a post-war order. Yet the very issues they tried to resolve, the fate of Poland, the future of Germany, the shape of Eastern Europe, became the cracks in the foundation of their partnership. What began as practical questions of war strategy soon deepened into existential disputes about power, sovereignty, and ideology. At the heart of these disputes lay Poland, a land whose fate had haunted European politics for centuries. For Stalin, Poland was not merely another neighbor. It was the corridor through which foreign armies had again and again invaded Russia, from the time of Napoleon to the onslaught of Hitler. To him, the lesson of history was clear. A friendly, pliant Poland was a necessity for Soviet security. For Roosevelt, Poland carried a different meaning. It was a symbol of self-determination, a cause dear to many Americans with Polish ancestry, and a test case for the promises made in the Atlantic Charter about the right of nations to choose their own governments. When Soviet troops entered Polish territory, installing a provisional government aligned with Moscow, the tension could no longer be hidden. Roosevelt pressed Stalin for assurances of free elections. Stalin replied with vague promises, convinced that any government unfriendly to Moscow on his western border was unacceptable. Germany posed another dilemma. Roosevelt envisioned a Germany rebuilt but disarmed, integrated into a system of international cooperation. Stalin sought a Germany so weakened that it could never again threaten the Soviet Union. Yet he also demanded reparations to rebuild his shattered land. Behind the public discussions lay mutual suspicions. Stalin feared that the United States and Britain might secretly consider a separate peace with remnants of the German leadership, leaving the Soviet Union to bleed alone. Roosevelt suspected that Stalin intended not only to secure his borders, but to extend his system deep into Central Europe. These suspicions colored every conversation, every exchange of letters, every diplomatic gesture. The delay in opening the Second Front had already left scars. Stalin never forgot that for nearly 3 years, his armies bore the brunt of the German onslaught, while Anglo-American forces concentrated on North Africa and Italy. Even after the landings in Normandy in June of 1944, he questioned whether his allies had deliberately delayed to weaken the Soviet Union. Roosevelt denied this, insisting that logistical reality dictated the timing. Yet the suspicion lingered. For Stalin, suspicion was more than habit. It was his worldview. He believed in betrayal because he himself had betrayed and survived betrayals. Roosevelt, for his part, struggled with the burden of illness. By 1945, his body was failing. Polio had long left him weakened, but now his heart and lungs labored with every journey, every speech, every conference. At Yalta, he appeared pale and frail, yet still determined to hold the threads of alliance together. Those closest to him knew that his strength was fading. Stalin noticed too, and in his shrewd calculations, Roosevelt's weakness was both an opportunity and a danger. It meant that promises might be easier to extract, but also that the American partner might soon vanish, replaced by someone less inclined to compromise. Even as Roosevelt pressed for cooperation, his advisors grew increasingly skeptical. Reports from Eastern Europe suggested that communist parties, backed by Soviet authorities, were consolidating power. Opposition figures were harassed, newspapers censored, political opponents imprisoned. These were not the free elections Roosevelt had envisioned. He continued to write to Stalin with the language of partnership, hoping to preserve goodwill, but his tone revealed growing frustration. He reminded Stalin that the credibility of their alliance depended on keeping promises. Stalin replied with assurances that sounded cordial, but meant little in practice. The divergence was not limited to Europe. Questions about Asia also strained the relationship. Roosevelt valued Stalin's promise to enter the war against Japan after the defeat of Germany. Yet he wondered what price the Soviet leader would demand. Territories in Manchuria, influence in Korea, and access to strategic ports all loomed in the background. Roosevelt hoped that the creation of the United Nations would provide a forum where such disputes could be managed. Stalin saw it more cynically, as another stage where great powers would maneuver. Churchill added another layer of complexity. He distrusted Stalin deeply and tried to enlist Roosevelt in curbing Soviet expansion. Roosevelt resisted, preferring to play the mediator, sometimes leaning toward Stalin to balance Churchill's harder line. Yet, by early 1945, Roosevelt's ability to bridge these divides was fading. His health and his belief in personal diplomacy collided with the harsh reality that Stalin was acting not out of trust, but out of strategic calculation. Despite all this, the public image remained one of unity. Photographs of the Big Three at Yalta showed Roosevelt smiling thinly, Stalin in his marshal's uniform, Churchill looking weary but defiant. To the world, it seemed a triumphant alliance on the verge of victory. But within those same halls, seeds of discord had been planted. The promises about Poland would soon collapse into recriminations. The division of Germany would evolve into confrontation. The United Nations, born of Roosevelt's vision, would quickly become a stage for rivalry rather than cooperation. As the winter of 1945 turned to spring, Roosevelt returned home exhausted. His speeches still carried notes of optimism, but his body could no longer sustain the strain. In April, only weeks after Yalta, he died suddenly in Warm Springs, Georgia. Stalin, informed of his death, expressed genuine regret. He called Roosevelt a great statesman and admitted privately that he had found him easier to deal with than Churchill. Yet behind the words lay a recognition that the passing of Roosevelt marked the end of any possibility of trust. The man who succeeded him, Harry Truman, had none of Roosevelt's patience for Stalin's evasions. Where Roosevelt had spoken of partnership, Truman spoke of firmness. Where Roosevelt had written letters of reassurance, Truman demanded clarity. Stalin soon found that the American tone had changed, and not in his favor. What Roosevelt had tried to preserve with words and goodwill, Truman would abandon in favor of confrontation. Thus, in the shadows of suspicion and in the failing health of Franklin Roosevelt, the friendship of necessity that had bound Stalin and Roosevelt began to unravel. They had achieved together what neither could have achieved alone, the destruction of Nazi Germany. But in the process, they had also created a landscape of division. The unity of the war would not survive the peace. The Cold War was already waiting in the wings, ready to emerge from the ruins of alliance. The death of Franklin Roosevelt in April of 1945 marked more than the passing of a president. It symbolized the end of a fragile experiment in personal diplomacy, an experiment that had held together the uneasy alliance of East and West through the darkest years of war. With Roosevelt gone, the bridge that connected Joseph Stalin to Washington collapsed, and what remained was suspicion, ambition, and the raw contest of power. Stalin understood immediately that the balance had shifted. Roosevelt, though wary and often frustrated, had sought to see the Soviet leader as a partner in shaping the post-war order. He had been willing to overlook much, convinced that respect and personal trust might bind Stalin to the vision of a cooperative peace. Harry Truman, the new president, saw matters differently. He had not been part of Roosevelt's intimate negotiations. He carried no personal bond with Stalin. Where Roosevelt had written letters of reassurance, Truman spoke bluntly of commitments and obligations. Stalin, accustomed to extracting concessions from Roosevelt's optimism, now encountered a leader who viewed him with open distrust. The first months of Truman's presidency revealed the new reality. At the conference in Potsdam during the summer of 1945, Stalin faced a very different American leader. Truman arrived determined to assert American strength, newly magnified by the successful testing of the atomic bomb. He no longer felt the need to flatter or accommodate. Stalin, for his part, stood firm, insisting on Soviet security and the recognition of his sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. The exchanges were civil but cold, lacking the veneer of warmth that Roosevelt had cultivated. The issue of Poland became the first open rupture. Truman demanded free elections, pointing to promises made at Yalta. Stalin, who had already installed a government loyal to Moscow, offered words but no change in practice. To him, Poland was non-negotiable, a matter of survival. To Truman, Stalin's duplicity was proof that the Soviet Union could not be trusted. The clash over Poland set the tone for every subsequent dispute. Germany, too, became a battleground of visions. Stalin wanted reparations to rebuild his devastated country. Truman and his advisors feared that excessive punishment would repeat the mistakes of the First World War and push Germany into permanent chaos. The compromise reached at Potsdam satisfied no one. In practice, each side governed its own zone as it saw fit. Within a few years, the temporary division hardened into permanent separation, with the Soviet East and the Western-backed Federal Republic representing two incompatible futures. The atomic bomb deepened the divide. When Truman informed Stalin at Potsdam that the United States possessed a weapon of unprecedented power, the Soviet leader reacted with outward calm but inward alarm. He accelerated the Soviet nuclear program, determined that Moscow would not be left defenseless. The very weapon Roosevelt had hoped might strengthen cooperation became instead the catalyst for an arms race that defined the coming decades. Roosevelt's dream of the United Nations as a stage for harmony quickly dissolved into confrontation. The Security Council became a forum for mutual vetoes, each side blocking the other. Speeches denounced imperialism on one hand and totalitarianism on the other. The New World Body, born of wartime unity, reflected instead the reality of division. Stalin, increasingly isolated, interpreted Truman's firmness as hostility. He saw American aid to Western Europe, including the Marshall Plan, as an attempt to encircle and undermine the Soviet Union. He responded by tightening control over Eastern Europe, ensuring that communist regimes followed Moscow's line without deviation. Political opponents were eliminated, economies were bound to Soviet planning, and dissent was crushed. The Iron Curtain, as Winston Churchill famously described in a speech in 1946, descended across the continent. For ordinary people, the transformation was stark. In Eastern Europe, hopes of freedom after the defeat of fascism gave way to censorship, secret police, and one-party rule. In Western Europe, American aid and integration fostered recovery and stability, but also a new dependence on Washington. The wartime unity of peoples who had fought together against Hitler was replaced by suspicion across borders, a sense that the world itself had split into two hostile camps. Stalin often recalled Roosevelt in later conversations, remarking that he had been a man of understanding, unlike his successor. Whether this was genuine sentiment or calculated rhetoric remains uncertain. What is clear is that Roosevelt's presence had restrained, at least for a time, the collapse into enmity. With him gone, there was little to prevent the clash. Truman was less patient, more blunt, and more willing to confront. Stalin was more entrenched, more determined than ever to defend his gains. The collision was inevitable. By the late 1940s, the transformation was complete. Allies who had stood together on the battlefields of Europe were now adversaries. The Berlin blockade and airlift marked the first major crisis of the Cold War. NATO was created as a Western alliance, and the Soviet Union responded with its own structures of control. The dream of Roosevelt's cooperative peace had died with him, replaced by a world defined by division. The journey from allies to enemies was not sudden, nor was it entirely personal. It was rooted in conflicting visions of security, ideology, and power. Yet the personal relationship between Stalin and Roosevelt had mattered. It had softened edges, delayed ruptures, and offered a fragile hope. Its collapse after Roosevelt's death made plain what had always been beneath the surface. The Soviet Union and the United States were bound less by friendship than by necessity, and when necessity ended, rivalry remained. The story of Stalin and Roosevelt is therefore the story of an alliance that could not outlive the war it was built upon. It is the story of two men who together defeated fascism but could not reconcile their worlds. From friendship born of desperation to enmity born of suspicion, their relationship embodies the larger arc of the 20th century, an arc that moved from victory to division, from peace to Cold War. Subscribe us. We don't say goodbye.